So Sharon Bridgeforth hails from Chicago and Los Angeles. Her performance work engages audience in improvisational storytelling through jazz aesthetics. Of her work, she has said, "A child of the African-American Great Migration, I came of age during assassinations, riots, the civil rights and Black Power movements, and soul music. I strive to queerly embody the unbending dignity, commitment to community, self-determination, and love of Black cultures that was modeled for me." Sharon hosts the podcast Who Your People Is, and her writings include the Bull Jean stories, Love Conjure Blues, That Black Mermaid Man Lady, and so much more. Also from Chicago, Margot Jefferson is a writer and cultural critic whose journalism broadened and challenged public understandings of Black artistry across a wide range of genres and sites of social contestation. In memoir, Negroland, and Constructing a Nervous System, Margot takes up personal lived history as a terrain for further exploration of the constellations of class, race, and gender that shape all her work. From Birmingham, England, Zafar Kunyal is a poet whose work investigates the expansive possibilities and mysteries of language. Drawing on Kashmiri and Anglo-linguistic forms, his poetry builds on what he calls the legacy of exchanging words across the centuries. He's the author of chapbooks 6 and Faber New Poets 11, the 2018 collection Us, and the festival celebrated the launch of his newest volume, which is right there, England's Green, just yesterday. Born in Islington, North London, to Jamaican parents, Winsome Pinnock brings the transatlantic world to vibrant life in her theater, bringing audience to a collective reckoning with racial and colonial amnesia. Consider the resonance of her first play, Leaf Taking, a migrant-centered account of the Windrush experience for understanding the ongoing expulsions of the present. So too her plays, Tituba, Mules, Winds of Change, and Rockets and Blue Light enlist us in breaking silences to unleash long subordinated powers of Black and migrant communities. So as we begin, I want to offer my gratitude to our prize winners. Your work nourishes our imaginations and honors the fact that migration is movement born of struggle and desire. And at a moment when governments and citizens have marshaled extraordinary force against the vulnerable, your work is especially precious. So thank you. So I'm going to start with questions for the panel, and we'll open things up to you to engage them in conversation about halfway through. I have some general questions that, again, I'd love to see where you want to take them, and specific ones to ask each of you. But I invite you to respond to each other, so we'll just do this the way your work also allows some improvisation. So I wanted to ask you to think about migration and mobility in the context of your writings, your performance work, your poetry, and use of language. How mobility and displacement have shaped the lived experience and the cultural imaginaries of the communities you write about.
Who would like to go over?
Yeah.
Sharon. No, because we just saw you last night performing exactly these mobilities, migrations, enforced, turned into desire and creativity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm so honored to be sitting here with you all and to have the generosity of your questions and your company and to be a recipient of this award. let's shout that out. And I sit here, I feel held and surrounded and purposed by many, by my ancestors, by people that sacrificed and prayed me here and worked for me to be here. People, I would say even my own mom, who could not in her imagination still to this day understand that I'm here, but certainly loved me enough to work to make it possible for me to be here. And I think about, and I may not exactly answer the question, but the thing that comes to heart is I think I'll speak specifically about my mom. My mom's from Memphis, and that's where I spent the most time. I grew up in South Central LA. My dad and my stepmom are from New Orleans. My stepfather's from Texas, and my other two parents, long story, they're from Oklahoma. But I'm going to talk about my mom. She raised me as a single parent, and you know, I feel very tethered and shaped by Memphis. And my mom was 20 years old, and she left home really because she was pregnant and unwed, and that was shameful in those days. Also, because she really craved a different life, a better life, and more possibilities than were available to her in Orange Mound, which is a neighborhood in Memphis where she grew up. And we landed in LA because there were relatives there. And I think about the circles and the migrations and the shaping that happened as happening in our living rooms. So for most of South Central LA when I was growing up, and I was born in '58, but I identify the early 60s, like I have a lot of memories from that time. There were so many parties, and there were so many, everybody that we knew was from the South, and they were not only Black, they were Black Americans. My world didn't expand until I was a little bit older and started taking the bus and started also going to school in different places in LA. So my world did expand, but that part of growing up that I remember in my earliest memories, they were Black people from a specific part of the South. My New Orleans people actually lived in a different neighborhood. They didn't live where we lived. And I think that's because people were following family. They were following opportunities that family and neighborhood friends could open, and they were just finding their way. But man, they had some parties. Ooh, and so I just feel like as a young person who was just in love with my elders and just like nosy, I was very nosy and curious. I just remember the dancing and the food, and I can still hear pork chops sizzling. And, you know, it's like the repetition of stories. I think there was a deep sense of grieving and the way they dealt with their grief of having to, really they had to leave home, you know, and they were lucky enough to be able to, and they were making better lives, but it wasn't what was promised. There was this constant sense of grieving that I, even as a young person, recognized in the repetition of their stories, in the calling of the names of the dead people. I would call them altars. So there was the velvet couch that you couldn't sit on, and then above that was a mantle with pictures of the dead people in our family, and they would call their names. I say that's an altar now. But yeah, those are some of the things that come to heart and oh my God, you had better behave. You better represent us well out there. And this knocks into my gender, you know, the ways that became very difficult for me as a multi-gendered person, which at that time I had no language for, but they would put me in some dresses and comb that hair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Winsome, and there was so much that I identify with in what you say, even though I was born in London in the UK, and there was something you said about parties that resonated with me, because as the child of parents who migrated from the Caribbean to the UK as part of a big movement of colonized people, really, from the Caribbean to the UK in the late 40s, in the 50s. They were invited to come to England after the Second World War to help rebuild Britain after that war and to do jobs that people didn't want to do, basically. And they thought of themselves as British subjects and were very proud of that. And so we're very happy to come to England in order to create a better life for themselves. But they came into a very hostile environment, and England wasn't really prepared for them. There was a big riot in 1959 in northwest London, where the white community turned against these new incomers, they called them, and basically attacked them. But as a result of that, and this is interesting, the world-famous Notting Hill Carnival was born from that racial violence, because the political activists in that area, and one of them was a woman called Claudia Jones, who was American via Trinidad. So she was born in Trinidad, but grew up in America, and she had been deported from America under McCarthy. And she set up one of the first black newspapers in the UK, and also was one of the founders of the Notting Hill Carnival, which was set up to unite the communities. So the money raised from that first carnival, which was held indoors in a town hall, went to help young people, black and white, who were charged as a result of the violence. They were imprisoned that night. So it was to help both, to unite, and that's the spirit of our annual carnival in London. But these parties that I, as a child of these migrants from the Caribbean, would go to, were as a result, a lot of the parties in the UK, say my parents' generation, would have parties because they couldn't get to any kind of cultural event in the UK. They were excluded from them. So they would throw these parties every Saturday as a way of, that was their entertainment. And so when I was growing up, us young people, their children, we also faced the same challenges, and were also excluded from these spaces. And so there were these parties that we would go to, where young men usually would build these huge sound systems, use speakers that they would transport in vans, and we would have these parties which were spaces that were essentially quite feminine, because outside these parties was a hostile environment where black men were being terrorized, I would say, by the police, really. And inside these spaces was a place of love and safety. So it was where young people would come together in intimate ways and soothe each other through the music. And born out of that was a genre of music called lovers rock, which is a kind of feminine reggae, so often sung by women, and so a kind of softer, version of reggae. And this idea of inside and outside is quite interesting to me, because inside was a completely different space to outside. Inside you were safe. And so I also grew up in a world that was like, inside the flat, the apartment I grew up in, was Jamaica. And outside was the UK. So I'd step outside and I'd be in London. But inside, I would be in Jamaica, or a version of Jamaica, which, because people who migrate lose aspects of their culture, but something interesting is born out of that. And lovers rock, the music I told you about, is a testimony to that. I felt very much as a young person that, because we were creating a new sense of Britishness, because we were British, but also something else, and that has had a huge impact on the culture of Britain, in fact. When I wrote my first play, and then I'll move on, I wrote about some of this. I wrote about a woman who had migrated from the Caribbean, a single parent like my mother, because my parents, their relationship broke up when they landed in Britain. They had this huge love story, but when they came here, It didn't last. I think the tension, the stress of being went to the UK. But I wrote this play that was it was kind of based on my mother's experience, or what I picked up, because one of the things I find about migrants is that they don't talk about these experiences, these painful experiences. So you have to kind of pick them up, read between the lines of their experience. They don't want to pass on painful experiences to their children who are creating a new life. You know, this is what they came to this country for you to better yourself, or that we represent hope, and they don't want to diminish that. So I wrote this play, and it was interesting how all of those years ago, when that play was first produced, 30 years ago now, there were words in it that people didn't understand, because I used some of the, the sort of language that I grew up with. But now, when the play is produced, it was produced in 2018, and people in the audience understand. Because, some of the words we would use that were a kind of code almost, that allowed us to communicate in a way that people, in this kind of secret way, had now passed into the culture, was part of the language of the youth of today. So that was interesting to see that change, and that new culture that we were building has become part of British identity, cultural identity. But you don't see that much, because the culture that's exported, I think, to around the world globally doesn't necessarily show that. So what you see of us is actually maybe an England that doesn't really exist anymore. And that's kind of interesting.
We might be speaking of Downton Abbey, but also
yes.
of less extreme examples.
I think something like that. So our experience, this experience of people like me and my parents, is often unrepresented, and so that's one of my. When I was young, that was one of the things that drove me to write. Especially the women's experience, because there were very few women who were produced. I don't know how many were writing, but very few female playwrights were produced in the UK when I started writing. And so you had this sense that you wanted to, I remember using this phrase when I was a kid, writing oneself into existence, sort of thing.
Yes,
that
thing was
that
second wave feminism. That was what we did. Yes.
Exactly. That was, the sort of thing that I was taught by my teachers who encouraged this.
Yes.
And that's the last thing I'll say. I was very lucky in that, to have these people encouraging me to tell these stories. And I'll leave it there, and I'm very grateful to them for having that for pushing us to embrace the arts and to think of ourselves as having something to say, and that what you had to say was valuable. I'll leave it there, Malcolm.
This is all very, very complex and fascinating, and so I have the speaker's version of the writer's dilemma, where to start. These narratives are unfolding. I am from Chicago. I grew up there, and I feel very, very intensely shaped by it. Chicago was, a major destination for all groups, all classes of blacks who were coming north, both driving themselves, propelling themselves north, fleeing north, many drives and motives. But the desire, yes, to make new and better lives in practical ways, but also in all of them to find a space, find a place that would allow them more access to their own inner lives and their own social lives. Both sides of my family, maternal and paternal, I'll just go back to grandparents, came from Mississippi. My father's family settled first in Denver and then on a quest for a better public education system and better work for my construction crew. Grandfather moved to Los Angeles where they had friends, but they bought a house, I don't know where they got the money, they've all died, in a largely white working class neighborhood. A cross was burned on their house, in front of their house the first night they moved into Los Angeles. Welcome to the American West. They, however, went to court to keep their house, and they won that. Wow. They won that suit, which is extraordinary. My father ended up, it's the family story is in certain ways a kind of almost idealized, could be seen that way, you know, American rise. The parents were basically school teachers and construction workers. My grandmother decreed, my paternal grandfather, my sons will be doctors or lawyers, and my daughter will be a school teacher. She's the one who got 3 master's degrees to make up for that. But you know, they achieved that, which would have been much harder. They were born in 1908, 1910, 1912 in the South. Virtually impossible because they were driven out basically for being too arrogant. Meaning you'd bring the laundry around if you were my aunt to the front door instead of the back. So my mother's family, and I want to get to female migrations. My mother's family relocated over a period of years to St. Louis, which is a southern and a northern city. But they had friends there again. They could buy some property there. My mother's father, my grandmother Lillian's husband, died in the flu epidemic. And within a few years, she staged a second migration of just herself and her daughter, my mother Irma. She was a widow. School teachers, who were all female, in St. Louis were not allowed, white or black or anything else, to marry. So she was a widow. So she basically was disqualified. And she knew if she stayed in St. Louis, not only were there fewer job opportunities, but she was with her in-laws, I mean, with her husband's family, and she thought she'd probably want to marry again. So, followed by the man who she married again and subsequently divorced because he wasn't ambitious enough in Chicago, she and baby Irma staged a migration to Chicago. They were joined, well, my parents met some years later because my father was leaving Los Angeles and his family. The migrations continue because there was not a black hospital, a successful running black hospital in Los Angeles, and there was in Chicago. There was Provident. Do you remember Provident Hospital? Yeah. So Chicago, for this world, my parents made their way into and up through, very consciously, was filled with people like that. They were intent on creating a world that has been variously called, you know, depending on the degree of self-interest or self-criticism, a black bourgeoisie, a black elite, a black aristocracy, a black imitating white people middle class. And, you know, there are many names for that. But I would say the worlds I grew up in, there was certainly still, even though it was becoming an integrated world, there was still very much that sense of a haven of their parties, of their clubs, of their fraternities and sororities as a haven for for a culture that was including all of the jazz musicians, black, who were coming to Chicago, and that allowed room for their own voices, the voices from, let's say, the southern or maybe western geographies they'd come from, a kind of rest, a kind of gestural theatricalism that took in as performance and as pleasure what we'd consider the black vernacular and gestural performances, and the more formally bourgeois white, quieter manners and ways of being that they were studying and performing, not always imbibing or internalizing. They were, my sister and I and our generation, we were born post-war generation, the 40s, the 50s. We were all simultaneously inculcated with that legacy, that variegated in terms of class and style and region, black culture, and we were being entered into the integration sweepstakes. Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. I was born in 1947. My parents made a decision, as did some of, not all of their friends, that we would go to white private schools, not only because this particular one was somewhat progressive, within the limits of progressive, but they didn't want us to be intimidated by white people, to have spent so much time sheltered that it would feel traumatic. That was a risk, and fortunately there weren't riots or demonstrations to keep us out. It was to some extent a sheltered progressive school, and that doubled in terms of our gender. My mother swore that my father once said, restaurants, these spaces were starting to open up. All of the black people in my parents' world would keep records and exchange words on, what hotels you could stay in, what hotels were serving blacks, which department stores you could try on the hats in or feel comfortable with, what Santa Clauses at Christmas in Marshall Field had been seen to put black children on their laps and behave perfectly well about it. There's a scene in Gwendolyn Brooks's novel, Maud Martha, set in Chicago, where the Santa Claus snubs Maud Martha's child. So they were always, this was all a form of surveillance that they kept, and in that way it's very kin to what you were saying about what the parents don't talk about. They tried to keep anxiety or nervousness about that muted. It might be muted, but it was never fully absent. And we, my sister's generation and mine, were busy negotiating, and that sounds a little, what I went through, and I don't mean that. We were being prepared to negotiate as smoothly as possible between those moments of anxiety. And you sense that someone's mother doesn't look that happy when you arrive for the play date. And a certain level of comfort, because these are people you are meeting in nursery school or kindergarten, and you are getting along. So there was always that move between a certain strategic but genuine unconsciousness and very strategic consciousness. So for me, migrations, the desire, the ardor, the ambition, sometimes a little ruthless, the need, the necessity, they are always accompanied, marked by double consciousness and sometimes triple or quadruple consciousness, I would say. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say, another gender point. I told you about, excuse me, no, I don't want my mother's mother. I will have my own independent life. And my children, they will go to these white schools so they will not be intimidated. At some point, apparently, my father, when we were young, said to my mother, we are going to make a point in terms of black and white restaurants, I want us to take the girls to very good restaurants because I don't want them to be snowed foolishly by some man who is courting them and has nothing to offer except what appears to be a fancy meal in a restaurant. So the preparing in particular of young black women, even as we are still adhering to the modes, was very much a part of. And we were clearly being trained to migrate, if you will, into an upper middle class white world. And now, my brother, it's your turn.
Just before I start, I'd forgotten that you wrote the introduction to Maud and Martha, didn't you?
Yeah, to the new one, the Faber and Faber one.
Such a beautiful book. Anyway, but I digress. But it's so nice to hear your stories. So where I grew up, it was just like Downton Abbey.
No. We sensed that about you.
No, it totally wasn't. I grew up in Birmingham, which is in the middle of England. My dad, who's from the Pakistani part of Kashmir, so Kashmir got cut into two and is administered partly by India and then by Pakistan, and they're still fighting over it. But my dad's from the Pakistani part, and he was the first from his village to come over, and he came over in 1956. And he met my mum in a pub in Birmingham. Neither of them wanted to be in Birmingham. My dad worked in a factory, and he had 2 months' wages given for summer, and he had 2 weeks off. And he was going to go to Scotland because he'd heard that Scotland was like Kashmir. But it just so happened that on the Friday night before he was due to go, he went to some casino and lost the whole two months' wages. So stayed in for a week. And then a friend of his kind of convinced him to come out, knocked on his door and said, you can't keep locking yourself in, punishing yourself, let's go out. And they went to a pub in the middle of Birmingham on a road called Needless Alley, believe it or not. And my mum, meanwhile, who grew up in Warwickshire, was white and from a small village in Warwickshire, she was training to be a teacher, and she wanted to go to North Wales, which was where her grandparents used to go on holiday. And on her way, she stopped off at Birmingham New Street Station and called a friend who convinced her to go out that night. And she happened to go to this pub on Needless Alley in Birmingham. And my mum said she'd never seen anyone who looked like my dad before. She hadn't got a clue where he was from. She thought maybe South American, didn't know anything. And she just said she fancied him, and they smoked the same brand of cigarettes. And that's why they got talking at the bar. So
that's a great gestural moment too. Yeah.
So and they ended up, and my dad actually already had a marriage. He had an arranged marriage to his cousin, which was the norm over there, but he wasn't happy in that marriage, and he'd come over to work. He didn't tell my mum initially. They organised to have a date. Their first date was in Stratford-upon-Avon, and that was where my dad told my mum that he had a wife and kids. And I remember he said that he waited 2 weeks to call her up for this date because he was worried. He knew that she lived with her white father, and he was really worried about the dad picking up the phone and hearing his accent, because he had a very strong accent. He couldn't really speak English, but he wrote very, very well, and his story is that he learnt to read English from the shop signs. He would look at and stare at the shop signs and see what they sold, and he would try to match the two things. And but he said that when he called my mum, she picked up straight away, and he was practicing how to say, "Hello, I want to speak to Julia," without having a strong Pakistani accent. But apparently my mum was waiting by the phone.
She was waiting, of course.
Anyway,
2 weeks is a long time.
Yeah. So that's a long story about how they met. But then, we grew up in Birmingham, and it was very mixed. So the next door house, it was a semi-detached house, and the house that was part of our house, there was a family from the Caribbean, so a Jamaican father, a mother from Barbados, and they helped to kind of bring. My mum wasn't confident at all with me as a baby. My dad worked nights in the factory. I wouldn't sleep very well, and the lady from Barbados used to come round, and apparently she'd hold me and give me a little bit of a shake, and I would go to sleep. My mum never knew how she did it, and so it was a very mixed family, mixed area. And the other side, there was a Hindu family from Uganda via India, and next to them there was a Sikh family. So it was very mixed, and I knew more people that weren't white than I knew that were. So but it was kind of normal. Yeah, do you remember, Winston will remember there's a band called Musical Youth, which were a kind of West Indian version of the Jackson 5, but with a bit more reggae influence. Yeah. But I went to the same school as they went to, which my mum taught at. So yeah, it was a very mixed area. Everywhere there were migration stories, just everywhere. And there were no parties, particularly where I was, but what I remember was all these different families had this thing in common. That's on our street. We all had that in common, really. But we wouldn't necessarily talk about it. I remember my dad, there was this kind of melancholy that you would feel when relatives would come around. And in his language, the word such means true. And so they'd often say this, they'd kind of sigh about things, and they'd say, such, like true, but they wouldn't elaborate. And when I was young, I would hear this word such, and I thought it was the English word. And I remember thinking, such what? Such what? And that's how I feel about this, like that there was this big untold thing.
Yes.
Such what?
Such what, yeah.
And yeah, that's my entry into that almost, is this such what, and there was this hinterland. There's all these hinterlands that you never know about, but they're there in every living room.
Yeah, that's right.
And the living room was a place where these things, like you say, these things play out. And there were a lot of arguments in our living room as well. And sometimes my dad would very threateningly say "you" to my mum, and he meant the British. He meant, or the British Empire even. And so all this was playing out in our living room.
Yeah.
I remember when the American program Roots came out.
Oh God.
And I remember I was 5 years old, and I really remember that program. I probably shouldn't have watched it because it really had a big effect on me. And the horrible scene when Kunta Kinte is being whipped, I remember that created a huge argument in our house because I said to my mum, "Oh God, that didn't really happen, did it, Mum?" And she said, "Don't worry about it. It's just." And my dad went crazy about that. My dad, and so that was a typical night, arguments.
Yes.
And
sudden.
Yeah, and that my mum somehow was the British or was white people, and my and I grew up with that, and it was all in the living room.
Such what, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of such what.
A lot of such what. I do remember, you just made me think, because we've been speaking about those things that aren't said. When Roots came out, I remember speaking to my parents, and there were still, some of them still had parents, and they said a number of grandparents who had been not speaking, not telling any stories about a slave ancestry or even, free black and always punished. These grandparents had been almost startled, rattled into starting to recite, almost as if they were monologues, these stories. They would cast their eyes down at the dinner table, they'd start talking, and the parents, who had children who were grown up, realized, I've never heard this before in my life. This is,
Yeah, I remember my dad was very proud because the family were originally Muslim, weren't they? And my dad wouldn't see many, so he loved Muhammad Ali, for example.
Yes.
And, anyone who was a Muslim on TV, he wanted to see someone to be proud, and he loved the family and roots being Muslim.
Yes.
And that meant a lot to
the
him.
search, the needing of that.
Yeah, and so any representation on TV was so important.
Oh God, desperately important. Yes.
What a gift. I'm going to transition to the audience to ask questions, but I just reflect for a second that the children in the communities that I work with who are Mexican and Central American are translators.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so much of the storytelling you're doing reflects taking that all in from those interiors, and through your art you have access to those interior spaces through your writings. So much of what racism does is deny us the sense that there is interiority at all. So it's
And
powerful.
then that it can be expressed,
Yes.
you know, rather than being
Yes.
too traumatizing or too
Yes.
shameful. Yeah.
Yes. You're all path breakers in that way, but it is, migration is a project, and children are the project, and children have to create that space that reconciles that inside and outside, and have to, it's why they are subject to so much discrimination, because they make it permanent.
Yeah.
The world is irrevocably different
Mm-hmm.
because the children are there. So just again, I'm just grateful to you. But please ask your questions. There are so many directions to go in. And my friends here are going to be passing the mic. So just raise your hand.
To Sharon and Winsome, what I really noticed from your story, well, I felt like I was reading a novel, I have to say, just listening to everybody. But you talked so much about the importance of your family's connectedness with you. So could you say anything more? I always have this fantasy, I don't know if it's true or not, that somehow having that connection and relationships are protective against growing up in an environment of trauma. So I wonder if you could speak about that.
Thank you.
The last bit of your question, sorry, the last bit that you said.
I always imagine that having close-knit family, connectedness helps protect people against the negative effects of growing up in traumatic kind of environments.
Yeah. There were a couple of things that people said that really spoke to me. One of them was what you were saying about being prepared, you know, of your parents preparing you for the life ahead. And I very much feel that my mother's main project in life was to do that for me. And it entailed a hell of a lot of sacrifice. And it also, it's one of the ways, you know, in which her silence resonated for me. So her actions in doing that for me spoke to me as I grew older and was making sense of it, of what she may have endured or experienced. So there were things that may seem not so important to others or didn't seem that important to me when I was a child. For example, we were very poor. But from the time that I was a little child, she would tell me things like, you know, that I had to save money. So I started saving when I was a little girl. And what I was saving for, in her mind, was that I would buy property. Sorry, because she had never owned. Well, she did actually. She did own property. She had, with my father, they'd bought, because people had to buy places, when they landed in the UK, as soon as they could, they would buy the cheapest properties they could. You know, they didn't have much money, because no one would give them a place to live. You know, there was this famous thing, no blacks, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. No, you know, so they couldn't get a place to live in. So people would band together, sisters, friends, would all kind of club together, buy a property so that they had somewhere to live. So one of the things that my mother told me, she lost whatever property she had, but that would be one of the things. You would own a little bit of property so that no one could kick you out. And so everything that she was preparing me for now speaks to me about things that she experienced as a black woman. And she never said to me, well, you have to, she did say you had to own property so that you were in charge of yourself. It's interesting winning this prize because I remember when I used to teach at a university and my mother would ask me how much I was earning, and I told her and she shook her head and she said, well, I thought you'd be earning blah, blah by now because you are a writer and all this kind of thing. It mattered to her. This would have mattered. It was important. So there's a lot I don't know about her. So you're talking about connectedness because I know she was very, she worked as a cleaner. And I know that she was very intelligent and gifted in many ways. So I used to be shocked because you'd throw a mathematical problem at her and she'd work it out like that. Mm-hmm. But she was a cleaner and was treated as such. And so some of my work in the early days was about writing about her, and you talk about that interior life and kind of exploring that, of having the characters sort of vaguely based on her speak in a way she never did, because that generation just didn't. There were, for a start, there was too much work to be done. They're too tired, exhausted. But, and often I think, if I win an award or something, I often think, well, it's interesting to win an award for writing and for speaking, but it's not necessarily me who's doing that. I feel, there's something, I can't even articulate it, I don't think, today, but what I know is that, yes, just another thing, is that I was being prepared to do this, to speak because she didn't have the opportunity to, wasn't actually allowed to. I'll leave it there, actually, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think my mom and the others that were part of our lives that migrated were carrying traditions that helped Black people. I think traditions that were just part of Black culture, but then also traditions that help Black people thrive and survive in unspeakable conditions. And so gathering, dancing, eating, taking care of each other, teaching each other, living as a unit, like those were just what we did. And so when my mom left the family area and moved by herself so far away, there were other people from places carrying those same traditions, and family was very much not about blood. So people gathered, they ate, they danced, they took care of each other, they made sure that folks had what they needed. It was also very complicated. There were fights and it was mess and it was like all of that. But I think that more even than back home, they needed each other. So it was a brilliant application of like applying what they had been taught to survive and thrive, even though it was really hard. And because I was sent to Memphis a lot, I saw it there too. Like it was just, yeah. So, and I do it too. That's how I am. Yeah.
Just to say also that speaking, I think, like writing, is really difficult in many, many, many ways. And I personally, I feel as the child of, these migrations, that you feel that there is a kind of subtle censorship that goes on. So to speak takes a hell of a lot of courage. And so you need that support because, you know, we can sit here, we do our work, but yet there is something so difficult or challenging about speaking or trying to. And often, and I suppose that's why often, you know, you talk about connectedness and community. I think that's why often a lot of us try to encourage others to do it because we need that community. And often in these, where we find ourselves as the children of migrations is as individuals in these spaces, which makes it much harder to speak because you cannot speak alone. You know, you can't act alone. You know, you need a number of people acting together, I find. So when I started writing, it felt really like a difficult thing, and maybe that's a deliberate, you know, maybe that's deliberate. You know, it's just a couple of people in these spaces who are successful. You know, because it sort of, because you've got a couple of choices really. You speak like other people are already speaking, or you don't really speak much. And both ways are a kind of, that's right, and both ways are about being silenced or erased. So you write, you try to.
That's that kind of double or triple consciousness that you're talking about, isn't it? That you have to think on so many levels.
Yes,
and
that's right.
Negotiation.
Yes, yeah, and you carry, but that maybe does prepare you to be a writer, you know, with that kind of multi-level thinking that you kind of have to do, that makes you quite insecure as a kid, but then because you almost have to do too many calculations to speak sometimes. And
But there is the censorship problem, though, that comes with that. You have to keep fighting, but, you know, we're not the only that writers are always struggling with some form of that. But yes, I think it does help prepare us.
And the boldness, though, the courage that's needed, then prepares other people.
Other people, yeah.
So you might take some flack because, you know, because the forms that the writing takes have to be new, doesn't it? You know, you have to find new ways of saying things. So you've got to take some flack for that,
which may be from people within your own community.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
But it gives others an opportunity to build on also what you're doing and take it further and, you know, be more successful. Each generation is building on the failure, so-called, of the last, because there has to be a sort of failing in a way. It's kind of inevitable because you're involved in in different kinds of fight, different kinds of challenge and, you know, resistance. Maybe.
Very, yes. And other kinds of acceptance, learning to,
Maybe you could just reflect a little bit further on the themes here because we're at the close.
That went fast.
I was going to say that there's also a shame, isn't there, that comes with if you know that you've become more articulate than a parent who perhaps have moved here or something, or moved and hasn't had that opportunity, if you like, to, you know, because I felt that a lot with my dad, you know, like his English wasn't good, and, you know, and he wasn't educated beyond the age of 7, and you know, to make it complicated, his school was bombed by the British during the war of independence, and so he had a lot of anger about I think he wanted me to be educated, but at the same time, I knew I'd crossed a threshold when I could argue with him, and it wasn't difficult for me to beat him in an argument. And that creates an extra layer of this double consciousness, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
And when I was writing a character who was similar to my mother, and using that, you used the word vernacular, and there was something so liberating about it, because I used to love my mother's accent and everything, but yes, one was made to feel outside the house ashamed of it, because in popular culture and everything, this way of speaking was seen, was kind of mocked. But then placing it on stage with that character as the main character, and the liberation it gave me in writing that, even though I can't really necessarily, use the accent myself. But there was such freedom in writing, or joy for me in writing, in creating a character who would be at the center of the stage, like that, a cleaner. As the heroine of this play, there was something so great about that for me.
That was your revenge play.
Exactly, yeah. So
it's tricky. There is also the conundrum of being considered by, again, other. There's the conundrum of the definitions from the larger white culture of what is acceptable in terms of black culture, and often it's the working class, it's vernacular that is looked down on. But it is also true that there's a whole critique that says, if you appear in some ways to have assimilated in manner and education and all of that into this larger, largely white world, surely you've lost something. Surely you're inauthentic. And that's that tension and that way of that hierarchical ruse, in a sense, is also there and affects how you modulate and moderate. My mother once said to me, this is a jump, it's preserving power in a very clever way. I was singing some black song, I forget, some soul song, and she said, your black accent isn't that good. She said, you sound like so many of those white rock and rollers who think that every Negro, this would have been in the early 60s, talks like as if he's from a certain region in Mississippi. There are many forms of black accent.
Wow, go ahead, Mama.
Pedagogy! Yes. So I thought, the best of both worlds in terms of reclaiming power.
Yes, yeah. I'll just say quickly, so I would get sent to Memphis. I'd come home and my mom and everybody would be correcting how I talked because I had picked up, and these were working class people. My mom grew up in a shotgun house. I think 10 people lived in that house. They call them tiny houses now. It was a shotgun house. She didn't know they were poor because they grew their food, they sold their clothes, and they took care of each other. And as her aunts got older, they lived across the street, so it was like a little thing. Anyway, but I'd come home and they'd be correcting my words so much that it was just nuts. But then they actually didn't speak correct English themselves. And so later, when I started writing, and I really the thing that, how I fell into my writing voice, as they call it, is so many of my elders had died and I just wanted to hear them. They certainly would not have been telling me the stories I was writing with all these queer people and juke joints and raucous behavior. But I was trying to hear them talk again. And when I started leaning into that, I understood how brilliant they were. So it was going back into their innovation of language that helped me really appreciate that. But my mom to this day will correct me.
Maternal power must out, yes, yes.
Well, I want to say thank you to our panelists and just reflect that in your work you have created a space for us to commune with so many people who have lived in your life, who shaped you and created the possibility of continuing to invite new stories, new language, new forms of poetry, new ways of understanding the world. And I want to just return us to where we started, which was a party in a house with multitudes, because the multitudes matter. They may not speak, but in that space, as you said, so much is created. And I want to say that migrants do learn from each other, because ska was the idiom in which my friends and I knew that there was something better out there for us. It was the idiom in which we knew we could create the relationships we wanted and the persons we wanted to be. We could move, you know. So ska made it all the way back to Philadelphia and to Los Angeles and to Mexico City. It changed the world.
Yes.
So,
Great.
thank you, my friend.
Thank you.